The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Twilio. Twilio believes good listening is good business. That's why they're helping brands build more intelligent voice experiences with Twilio Voice API. Visit twilio.com/voice to learn more.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Morra Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better. When it comes to mental health, what is it exactly leaders can and can't say? That's what we're talking about today. The delicate balance between being vulnerable and human, talking about mental health struggles so other people can feel open, and the realities of life in a world that creates a lot of stigma around mental health. One guest you'll hear from is Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmonson, the pioneer of the concept of psychological safety at work. Amy notes we're all vulnerable because we're human, because we live in the world, but that gives us a choice. We can think about vulnerability as a strength, or we can continue thinking in ways that don't serve us well, thinking that understanding, expressing emotions is a weakness. We've come a long way, but our second guest, entrepreneur and best-selling author Peter Sims, points out that many C-suite executives of big corporations are just not ready, may never be ready to speak openly about their mental struggles because they fear they'll be judged as weak. But we also touch on the undeniable truth that being a leader is tough as it's ever been. Many leaders feel they have the weight of the world on their shoulders. Where does all that anxiety and stress go? Even if they don't speak up about their personal struggles, our third guest explains that leaders can still do a lot to open up space for more vulnerability at work, or at least help us prevent a culture of silence. Megan Reitz of Oxford University and Hult International Business School walks us through how leaders can break out of their bubbles and listen to improve trust for everyone. We grapple with all these issues around leadership and mental health today in our fourth and last installment of the series between Thinkers50 and Silicon Guild, Mind Matters. And next week, The Anxious Achiever kicks off Season 10. I just want to start with this really quick thing about what happens when we connect, especially through story. You've probably heard that we are wired for story. Do you know that when you hear a story unfold from another person, your brain waves actually start to sync up with those of the storyteller? This is from Uri Hassan at Princeton. He says, it's as though I'm trying to make your brain similar to mine in areas that really capture the meaning, the situation, the schema, context of the world. We make meaning, share context, and learn from challenges through story and through speaking up. And so that's why I'm so thrilled to have you all here to tell us about your work and your stories. And I'm going to start with Megan.
Thank you very much. This topic of mental health is incredibly close to my heart, and it is hugely important. The way we speak up about mental health, to state the obvious, saves lives. It's that clear. And I suppose I've got three things that I'd kick off with, really. One is, of course, a leader's role in speaking up and enabling others to speak up around mental health is hugely important. Secondly, but not if it's performative. So actions speak louder than words. And thirdly, our actions and our words are situated in a system that has certain rules of the game that make it incredibly difficult for us to connect in a way that improves mental health. So as well as looking at the leader's role and the conversation inside an organization, we have some serious questions to ask about the system as a whole. So just to come back to each one of those. The first one, what a leader says, what a leader doesn't say, even more so, gets replicated across the organization. So their role is hugely important. And their role in inadvertently silencing conversations is worth paying attention to. So yes, speaking up, but also the blind spot that myself and John Higgins, who's my co-researcher, we've really been exploring over the last 10 years, is the fact that as you get more senior, or if you get more into a powerful position, whatever that might be, even if it's not hierarchical, you are likely to go into what we call an optimism bubble. And that means you'll overestimate the degree to which people are speaking up around you. You'll overestimate your listening skills, and you'll overestimate how approachable you are. And we've surveyed about 21 or 22,000 employees now. And the data of how that happens as you go up an organization is really pretty clear. So the first thing is probably leaders might already think that they're having quite good conversations in the workplace, or that at least, classic phrase, my door is always open. So of course people can speak up about it. It's fine. It's fine. And that's the first thing we need to crack. And we need to say, actually, possibly it's not as easy if you don't have the same labels on your head with the power and with leadership labels. And we might have to do a lot more work than we realize to really help people feel at ease and to speak up. In particular, I would mention in this first point, how we respond when people speak up about mental health it defines whether somebody else will speak up afterwards. So all it takes, and I've seen this happen, all it takes is for a leader to kind of look rather puzzled or frustrated or unsure when somebody does bring up a topic that's tricky. And that will really figure in everybody's minds, and they'll be a kind of like, right, we won't talk about that again. So our response as a leader really impacts the habits of conversations that we have in an organization. That's kind of the first point. The second point is, when I read the title of this session, leaders should embrace mental health, I must admit, because I work a lot at various conferences in the run-up to conferences, and I had this image of a kind of HR or corporate communications person with a leader sat in front of them, rather kind of carried and hurried, saying, right, make sure you embrace your mental health on stage.
I've seen that happen. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Insert vulnerable anecdote here.
Precisely. So please come up with something in your background that will cover mental health. But, it's got to fit between these. Don't make it too far this way, or don't make it too. And can you embrace it on stage, please? And employees kind of see straight through that.
And be authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was struck actually in our research, there's two different stories. One story of a young lawyer who had some time off with a mental health issue. And then the organization was so careful bringing that lawyer back in and actually slowing them down and really holding their hand all the way through. It was really amazing. And then another story that we've come across where, the financial services, where, director they have an allocation. I mean, if you're off with mental health, you get your 6 therapy sessions to try and get you back in as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. And it really is that instrumental, which brings me on to the final point, and then I'll shut up. My current research with John is on what we call spaciousness, and how do we create the experience of a sense of space where we can have the conversations that matter inside what I call pathologically busy organizations. And there's 2 stances, I suppose, 2 orientations that we see in an organization. This is inspired by Ian McGilchrist's work and Martin Buber. One is what we call instrumental. And in an instrumental gaze, we see ourselves as separate, as fragmented, as utility. There's a means to an end. The focus is on short-term, tangible targets. Busy, doing. Really important, okay? That's necessary. Another frame is what we call the relational gaze. And that's when we have a broader perspective. We see our interdependence. We see our relationship to one another. And we make very different choices depending on what gaze we have in the organization. And you can't meet a mental health issue and crisis just with more instrumental processes. You have to question the whole way we look at work. And whilst this may sound rather sort of dreamy, actually it comes down to, what the hell are we doing? Why are we working? What is the point? Why are we working together? And what is the point of my leadership? And it's there in those really crucial questions, actually, that we start to genuinely kind of have the relationships and the kind of conversations that help at work.
I love the spaciousness. In one of our earlier sessions, we were remarking on the time that a leader actually took the time to show us something, to help us to channel that spaciousness that I'm here for you, and I haven't just mentally moved on to the next. Megan, I just have to give you a statistic that I pulled. This is from Headspace's most recent data. Since 2020, the number of employees who reported their company leaders talk openly about their personal mental health has more than doubled. It was 35% in 2020. And Headspace is reporting 89% of leaders are talking openly about their personal mental health. And yet, employees are feeling less cared for than ever. Their own mental health gets worse. When you hear that statistic, what comes to your mind?
Well, what comes to my mind is one, we, as I said, I think we really have to be careful when it's performative.
Yeah.
I see performative speaking up all the time. I see leadership teams stating how they want everybody in their organization to be collaborative, and everybody's looking at the leadership team going, "You're kidding, you're all in silos and you hate each other." That is one issue. And the other issue is we're inside what is increasingly a broken system.
Yeah.
We're inside a system where the instrumental gaze has got out of control, and our focus on the doing, on the short-term targets, means that we're squeezing out some of the other conversations that we absolutely have to have if we're to set up an organization that enables us to flourish. So the more that we end up focusing on this sort of instrumental gaze, the less we end up being able actually to allow the kind of conversations which are relational. For example, we have in our research one phrase that is, you need to have the small conversations to enable the big ones to happen. So in other words, if we squeeze out those conversations where we see one another as human beings with stories, with lives, if we squeeze out those moments where we genuinely encounter one another, then you can forget about the kind of big conversations where we need to talk about mental health, and the big conversations where we need to offer a crazy idea or say, and Amy will know lots about this, or say, actually, I'd made a mistake. We've had a failure. Those big conversations can't happen unless we nurture and pay attention to the relationships that are there. And we are in systems, economic, organizational, political, educational, health systems that are narrowing our gaze down to more shorter term, tangible, instrumental results, I think, given the latest research that we're doing. So I'd point to those two.
Thank you. Amy.
Okay. So, the remit was unlocking mental health. I wanted to share 5 things that I think are relevant for this discussion, but I can't help just backing up and saying during the introductions, just even your wonderful book, Morra, Anxious Achiever. It's like here I am. Yep, I'm an anxious achiever. So I'm, glad and grateful to be here. And then, of course, the whole accidental writer, Peter. I've always called myself an accidental professor. It really was a kind of strange accidental left turn that landed me here. So lots of learning, lots of mistakes, lots of setbacks along the way. Unlocking mental health in the workplace. Here is what I wanted to offer. So number 1, reframe reality. The messaging. Let's get out ahead of people's automatic, taken for granted sort of assessment of what leaders expect or of what the work is like, what the job is like in reality. And we need to set expectations to fit reality. the world is complex, uncertain, volatile, and all the rest, right? And when we don't talk about that, we tend to feel it's just me, right? I'm the one, I missed a deadline. The project didn't come out the way I had hoped. I had a failure here. I made a mistake there. That's normal and natural. Like let's normalize it. Let's destigmatize it. Let's embrace that reality together. We got to talk about it, make it discussable all the time. Number two, and maybe this should be number one, but double down on purpose, on meaning. And this ties into what Megan was saying too. I think part of mental health is the belief that you matter. I think one of the biggest factors in reduced mental health is the sense that you don't matter, right? And you might not matter because you might not think what you're doing matters, is noticed by customers or clients, or even more important, colleagues, right? That mattering both to the world and to each other and to the people that you come in contact with every day is part of health. It's part of being human. It's part of what makes us want to get out of bed in the morning. Not just happiness and comfort, but that belief that we matter. And so we need to double down on talking about it. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that this organization exists or that this project exists? Number three, double down on community. And that builds so nicely on Megan's relational point. We need robust, authentic relationships that are based on, realistic understanding of and appreciation of each other and support, a kind of a desire to support and a desire to be accountable with and for each other. Let's build those kinds of robust relationships. I agree. It's when we squeeze out the moments, the life moments, that can get in the way of that important factor. And oddly, in the early stages of the pandemic, when we were all sent home, and I realized something very obvious, but my wonderful faculty assistant at the time, her name is Sarah Nicholson. She's a genius. She's amazing. At the time, I remember thinking, we had to keep working, right? We had our remote setup. It would have felt so odd and awkward to sort of call her up and say, hey, how was your weekend? Like that would have just been intrusive and weird. Whereas in a in our normal life before the COVID sent us all home, I would not come in on a Monday and not say that, not share some of my own tribulations and so on, building, what I think is an authentic friendship and relationship. Okay. Number four, build scaffolding to invite input. By scaffolding, I mean rituals, whether those are rounds or wonderful ways that we either do check-ins or we brainstorm ideas. Just structure is your friend on this thing. With everything that Megan and I have studied about voice and speaking up, it doesn't happen spontaneously. It needs help. It needs scaffolding. More on that if you wish. And then lastly, I think both for leaders, but also for each and every one of us, master the pause, meaning take a breath and ensure a productive, collaborative, kind of caring, I don't mean to overstate that, but just thoughtful response to what you hear. Someone disagrees with an idea you really care about. Pause, breathe, express interest. It should be genuine, and dig in, roll up your sleeves, get into a higher quality conversation as a result of that surprise. But it's helpful to kind of take a breath so that you can help yourself respond productively. So let me stop there.
I'm taking a pause, Amy. You write so movingly in the book about our very human need to keep up appearances, to be seen as smart, right? To fear being shamed, right? How do you help people as a leader get over that? Because us high achievers, right? We've talked about this. It's kind of in our DNA a little bit, but we have to, at some level, learn to move past it.
A wonderful former mentor, he's no longer alive, Maxie Maltzby, a psychiatrist and wonderful thought leader in the space of cognitive behavior therapy, but he called it rational behavior therapy, his little blend, said, we are all fallible human beings, right? And then he shortcut that to FHBs, which I loved. It made me smile. So why do I bring up Maxie? Because his point was, this is just a fact. Right? Yeah. So call attention to it, make it discussable. That's not going away. We will always be fallible human beings. Can we thrive as fallible human beings? That becomes the question, right? That becomes the life question. Not can you not be one, not an option, but can you thrive as one? So I think it's A, call attention to it. B, make it discussable. And C, express caring about others' experiences, others' tribulations, others' hopes and aspirations, and then realize it's only fair to share your own as well.
Peter.
This is such an interesting topic. And, I'll share some personal reflections and then also some of the things that we've seen on the corporate side. So my company, Black Sheep, has worked with some Fortune 500 companies on how do you destigmatize mental health. And I think the reason this moved, and we started this about 5 years ago, so SAP and ServiceNow and BlackRock became interested 5 years ago in how do you destigmatize mental health, because it was sort of a continuation of diversity and inclusion. It was kind of the next wave. And I think there were two reasons that there was interest from these CEOs. One is that the culture shifted a lot. I mean, organizations are driving this shift in mental health. I mean, this is completely coming from musicians, artists, people who are kids talking about mental health that's trickling up to organizational change. Every family is affected by mental health. So that was just something we realized early. So I think the learning and the growth may happen. There are spaces that get created in organizations that are useful. BlackRock now has 600 ambassadors for mental health. But I think the primary source of change is going to come at the family unit level and in the culture. That is to say that young people are going to talk with their parents and say, I'm having challenges, and they're going to connect with that challenge from their kid emotionally and feel like they can talk about mental health differently. So I'll just share an example personally. So I'm an entrepreneur, and last year I had a very challenging year. And really for the first time in my life, I experienced depression. And it was pretty severe. I was, Googling everything I could, like Eckhart Tolle and every resource, trying to figure out what the hell to do. And I was pretty open with people about this. And on the one hand, I was open with people who are older than me and senior, and including some CEOs who I know of big organizations. And these guys and all men, they really didn't know what to do with this set of questions. And I think it's a generational thing. Like, they just don't have the tools. They were used to saying just tough through it. And the younger people I talk with who had experienced depression said, just be patient with yourself, give yourself self-care, you'll get through this. And their advice was the right advice. So I look back on that experience, and I've talked to some of the people who were, who couldn't advise me in the past. And I said, I think you're missing a piece of the toolkit to be able to actually work through this type of situation. And it's not that they haven't gone through something similar. Many of them had, but they just never had been around anyone who could give them perspective that was more enlightened, really, just more insightful. And so I think that for those types of leaders who are currently running most organizations, there's a huge generational shift that's coming. And if this topic is to gain significant change inside organizations, it's going to be because the younger generation is going to come up and they're going to have a different set of tools and experiences to really drive, lasting change. So I'm very optimistic about that. And I just think that this is one of those topics that, unless you have something that you can personally relate to, it's intimidating. It's very scary for people. And if you don't have the tools, how are you supposed to try to respond to somebody who is raising a topic that you just have no emotional experience with? It's asking, I think, too much of people. So, within an organizational context, I think what's most potentially empowering is to say, look, there's somebody in your family who you can connect with at an emotional level. Maybe it's your aunt, maybe it's one of your kids, maybe it's one of your sisters or brothers, and you can say, look, for them, how can you be there for them? And based on that emotional experience, how can you then connect with other people, even if they have different situations they're going through, to be able to help them understand that this is in a best case scenario where people get treatment or where people get help, that stigma should actually be a superpower. I mean, we know with people on the spectrum or people with different mental illness disorders that this is often a source of their greatest strength. So it really is a set of human questions, I think, that emanates back to a generational shift that is coming, aided by kids talking to their parents and by the realization that many of these situations are very treatable with the right type of advice. And you don't have to do everything in a mental health situation, because mental health itself is a scary term, but it's just, what would you do for somebody in your family in this situation? And then hopefully organizations can continue to do like what the leading organizations have done, is surround themselves with support structures so that, people can get sent to the right advisors. So that's my take. It's definitely a movement. It's unstoppable. It's a generational shift that's coming. There's a lot of confusion right now as to how people should handle the stigmas, and how there's just, it's one of those in-between periods. But ultimately, it is, in terms of effective leadership, it's a source of our finding the highest superpowers for people working with us.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by AT&T Business. Did you know 90% of business owners struggle with sleep? We totally made that up, but it felt real, huh? Rainn Wilson saw this as a business opportunity to change the way the world sleeps by launching a talking pillow powered by AT&T Business's security, reliability, and expertise, designed to help people sleep. As Rainn says, you can't dream if you can't sleep. Take your business to the next level at business.att.com.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors, I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
I'm curious about the role of story, and any of you can take this. I find in my work with leaders that, even if I haven't had depression with a capital D or anxiety with a capital A or bipolar, I've been through challenges. I've struggled. And we as humans are wired to connect to that narrative of facing challenge, learning, and building resilience. And I'm curious if any of you in your work have seen the power of helping people use narratives successfully, right? Or speaking up, Megan, with skill in a way that actually can shift the mind of that person Peter's talking about, who, is the CEO and is like, I've never felt this. I don't want to talk about this.
Peter, really interesting what you were talking about, particularly around how many are unpracticed in these sorts of conversations. And we are in such an interesting time where it's up for grabs what sorts of conversations happen inside our organizations. And we do have a generation of people that aren't used to that being far outside of the box of kind of, well, it's about business. And I think what you're talking about is sort of experiential knowing. When we have experiential knowing, that's very different from propositional, cognitive knowing about something. We talk about things very differently when we have our own point of reference, and then we talk from that place. It, of course, is very different. And it is possible for anyone to have a conversation with anyone else, even if they may not immediately know the experience. If we foreground hugely, our real desire to learn and to understand and to hear what we don't understand and being curious. It's incredibly powerful when we speak from experiential knowing. And when we don't have that experiential knowing or can't access that, then it's incredibly powerful when you meet someone that looks at you and goes, tell me. Just tell me, honestly. And you can see that they really want to learn. So I'd sort of say, both of those orientations are incredibly helpful. And especially when you're in uncharted territory that Peter was talking about.
I can share a thought on this too. I co-authored this book, True North, about authenticity and leadership with Bill George, and there was a lot of focus on being vulnerable. And really, what we found, or what I learned through that process, is that vulnerability, as reported from a historical experience, is valuable, but vulnerability in the moment is not a good playbook. And so, and as it relates to mental health, I think talking about experiences with mental health in your own situation is probably frowned upon. I can do it because I own my company, but for a CEO like the CEO of Nike or Starbucks, both of whom I know, I don't think it's a great idea for them to be talking about a mental, severe depression. They can't really do that. I think they can talk about family members, or they can talk about old friends disguising the identity and talking about their experience with that situation, with that person, and what they learned from it, and creating space that way. So that's just a thought that came to my mind. I haven't overthought this, but
I want to give you a shout out for saying the truth. A lot of us in the mental health at work field don't actually come out and say what you just said, which is that it's dangerous for the guy in power to talk.
Guy or woman, anybody.
Or a woman. It's more dangerous for a woman. I wish that weren't so. I'm going to ask a question from Frank. What are concrete initiatives to shift the perception of vulnerability? And let's talk about stigma around mental health, from a weakness to a strength. Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a losing argument in this space. People are just not going to talk about it when they feel like the buck stops with them, unless they're retired or entrepreneurs or whatever.
I have a different take on vulnerability, which is that vulnerability is merely a fact. Right? We are all vulnerable in that we don't have a crystal ball. Right? So we're vulnerable to all of the things that are coming at us, of which we're unaware at any given time. And when we conceptualize that being at least part of what it means to be vulnerable, it is a strength to acknowledge that. Right? It is a strength to say, here's what I care about, here's what I'm unsure about, anxious about, need you, right? We need to hear from you. We need your hard work. We need your full engagement, right? So vulnerability is only a weakness in a world that expects to run on time, right? Expects predictability, expects certainty. We don't live in that world.
Also, I think that there are so many leaders who are looking for an opportunity to share. The statistics I once dug up around prescriptions for anxiety and depression drugs in this country are actually equate to about 40% of the population. And so someone's taking them, and it's not all young people. I think that there is a way to push. I have another question from Elizabeth. How do we avoid preaching to the choir around mental health? The people here, both speaking and attending, surely know the importance of the topic, but how do we not just talk in echo chambers? Peter, I think you were getting at that. How do we reach the people who have resistance, genuine blissful ignorance, God bless them, or just don't care enough to make the necessary changes?
I would say on that question, figure out who their kids are, and, go through their family, talk to them about their family story. Reflecting on Amy's comments about vulnerability, I'd like to believe that people can be vulnerable in Fortune 500 companies. I just think that if I put myself in the shoes of a CEO or the C-suite, which sets the tone, they're under so much pressure to hit the numbers and to have a good presentation on the next earnings call. And any sign of them having doubt is going to be potentially captured by someone, that's going to be reposted somewhere that somebody's going to ask a question about. It's like, I think it is a systemic issue based on the system that we're in. It just doesn't reward any form of vulnerability, in my opinion. And again, I own my own company. I can say whatever I want. It's great to be so free.
I just want to maybe make a distinction that is between the sort of my personal life, my marriage is falling apart, my life is horrible, whatever, and the vulnerability that I think effective leaders must display if they're running, large complex organizations. For instance, American Icon, the wonderful book on the turnaround at Ford, when Alan Mulally says, listen, team, we're on track to lose $17 billion this year. That is a statement of vulnerability, right? We cannot keep going this way. There will be a point where they shut us down. Let's start telling the truth to each other. It's a statement that the company's vulnerable. I'm vulnerable. If you don't want to play, this isn't going to work, right? And I've kind of staked everything on this, right? It's implicit in that message. So I think when we to include sort of the reality, even the reality you said, which is that, earnings calls and sort of reputations can be at risk when things are taken out of context. That's part of the reality. Let's make that discussable too.
Yeah. Business realities, I think, I agree with that. I just think if people knew what was going on inside the CEOs of these companies, they'd be shocked because they are so vulnerable. They are so human and they can't say any of that. And they're in a tiny little container without many real friends at all. I mean, it's brutal.
Where does all that anxiety go? I mean, if I'm about to report earnings and they're not good and I'm going to get attacked, I'm anxious.
There's an irony here, isn't there? That, there has been an invitation for the past 5 years or so, especially from people in leadership roles, to employees to bring their whole selves to work. And they've basically been leaving out the terms and conditions. And I absolutely get that stating bring your whole self to work, it'll be fine, is naive. Okay. We turn up at work and we are performing. All of us at some level, it is the theatre of business, the theatre of performance. We have that going on. And if those in powerful positions have no capacity to show any level of vulnerability, then we are in serious trouble. I was at a conference this morning and I listened to a leader speak really well from the stage. And this sounds very small in comparison to mental health, perhaps, but he was talking about how to have the difficult conversations and how he gets actually, quite nervous before, it's an hour before the feedback conversation he's supposed to be having with somebody. And he was talking, God, I'm just, you could just, in that moment, you could see him as a human being. Yeah, he wasn't bearing everything, obviously, because he can't do that position that he's in. But he was showing just signs of actually, I have these feelings, I have these emotions also. And that's such an important capacity for leaders to go into, to edge into that kind of zone. So yes, of course, there are territories, there are things they can or can't say. If they can't say anything, then, why on earth are we trying to help other people in their organization as well?
Well, yeah.
It's a bit of a challenge.
I just think that's a great story. And that's exactly what I was talking about. That regular human emotion that, say, we might all experience when we're having to do a performance conversation. Right? And that this leader is acknowledging that, naming it. I feel, anxious. I feel my stomach is bothering. It's that I think is a very good concrete illustration of what it looks like to be vulnerable around a kind of ordinary aspect of the job.
It's called boundaried vulnerability, right? So I'm human. I'm just vulnerable enough, but I'm not a mess, right? I'm not going to go on about my kid, my divorce and how my kids hate me. But I'm not sleeping well because this merger is really stressful. Yeah.
People don't say that, though, very often. I don't think. I mean, I do think, yes, to highlight their emotion is great. And to be able to say, and look, I'm not a cynical person here. I'm just saying, yeah, you can talk about your mother and you can talk about, things in your life personally that people can grab onto. That's crucial. You have to be able to tell those stories. But I think to get up and say that you're anxious about something, I mean, you can say it's a big challenge. You can, as Amy says, you can point out the business imperative and the business challenges that are obvious to everyone and not hide from that. That's crucial. But that's different than talking about your emotional wiring and your emotional fabric. I've not seen many leaders be able to do that well. I mean, I'm trying to think of one person who could, outside of a persona in a big organization, navigate that.
You should listen to my podcast.
Maybe that's my...
But it's hard. I have a hard time getting certainly people from public companies to go on the record. It is a huge challenge. Where do we go from here? The system's broken. Things need to change. Where do we go from here?
It's changing.
It's changing.
It's changing. The culture's changing. The organizations aren't going to change this. The culture's changing. The kids are going to change it with their parents. All these signals we get from movies, artistry, it's all saying that mental health is part of life. So the policy world is following that as well.
I completely agree with Peter. I think it is changing. I think it's changing in a way that quite rapidly, quite starkly. I want to go back to something Megan said at the very beginning, which is near the end of her comments, which is that the system is broken. And it's not just the system in terms of mental health. It's literally the broader system is broken. We have companies producing things we don't need. We have, rampant consumerism of things we don't need that don't make us happy. We're, especially compared to experiences and relationships and all the rest. The research is pretty darn clear on what builds happiness and longevity. And it's not stuff. I think we're talking largely about cosmetic fixes, right? How do we fix it around the edges? And of course, I'm sure, certainly speaking for myself, I feel utterly helpless in terms of how do we address the root cause, right? How do we address the root cause of the mental health crisis, which I think has to do with people's sense that a lot of things are broken in a very large way. And of course, that is ultimately a leadership issue. So maybe there are opportunities here for leaders to get out ahead of these challenges and figure out what we really need to work on together.
Actually, Amy, that leads me to a question I have for you, but anyone can jump in. You are a team person. You really help us think about what can be done on a team. A team is so much more flexible than the CEO and leadership and the system. If I'm a team leader, if I'm a manager who really wants to change things, how can I start modeling this productive vulnerability tomorrow?
It comes down to three broad categories, behavioral categories. One is messaging. The second is modeling, as you just asked. And the third is kind of mentoring. And the messaging is, just repeated and truthful messages about purpose, about challenge, about what we're up against, why it matters, why each and every one of you are needed to do this well. Sort of the right communications that engage and inspire. The second is modeling, and I think that's what you asked about. And modeling is, how do I show up as a caring and, passionate about the possibilities here, but curious, humble. I know this sounds like a tall order, but it's not really as tall as it sounds. And fundamentally emotionally intelligent person, right? Who is trying to build a team, fully cognizant of the reality, which is we can't do it. I can't do it. I need to do my part, but I can't do it alone. I need you, utterly dependent on you. The great teams have kind of the capacity to use each other's strengths and weaknesses, to interact in a candid way, to ask good questions, to argue their points carefully with as much evidence as they can muster, to listen, to change your mind, right? There's a kind of dynamism of a good team. So I think the leader's first job is to build a great team at the top, modeling, therefore, that teamwork that then others in the organization, other teams will start to emulate.
Yeah, I think many managers and leaders, many of them have really good intentions. And it's about, creating that space where we're able to remember how we want to show up. Amy's talking about how we show up is really important. The question I'm holding is, so we interviewed somebody a while back and they said, at work, in my team meetings, it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, was the metaphor. It's kind of like, I actually now can't breathe. I've got so much stuff to do. And in fact, Amy was mentioning the pause. Really interestingly, in our research, the phrase permission to pause has come up over and over and over and over again. How do I give myself permission to pause? How do I give others and enable others to give permission to pause? And part of this, is how do we create spaces in systems where we actually remember what it is we want to do, what our intention is, how do we show up? Some of my other research is in relation to mindfulness, which is essentially paying attention to what you're paying attention to. Yeah. And how do we enable ourselves to pay attention to what we are attending to? How can we set up some kind of ritual every day where we just try and bring again that compass, the compass point of like, how am I showing up? What is the impact I want to have here? Many leaders I work with, they don't need long to kind of reconnect with it and go, oh, right, okay. And then they make small but significant, different decisions and choices during the day. But they just need that kind of capacity, that discipline, that mission, that space to just reset the compass again and again and again, because we're inside systems that drag us away from the compass all the time.
All the time.
And we put our attention onto stuff that actually is not the stuff that we need to be attending to.
I'm going to close with a really personal rapid fire question, which you can answer however you want. I'd love you to share a way that you have learned to pause when you're worried you're not showing up as a leader you want to be, or when you're feeling anxious or having a really tough day. How do you communicate that constructively to people so they can work with you more effectively, or if you don't?
I can say that when I am feeling anxious, truly anxious, it is like being in a vortex where I can't even see that I'm in a vortex. That's what it's like when you're circling kind of in anxiety. The zone of what you can see narrows. And the metaphor I have is that I have learned over time to know where my lifelines are. Which ropes, when I'm in that vortex, what are the ropes I can grab hold on? One is I know there are a handful of people that I can wave at and go, sinking, help. And they know, they get it.
They get it.
That's one really important, know your lifelines and know who is it that you have that gets it and that can throw you a line. And the second thing that I do is I have a mindfulness practice. So I train my brain, if you like, is a basic way of saying it. I train my brain every day, mainly, sometimes. Anyway, mainly, most days, I train my attention, because that is a practice. We leave our brains very much up to chance, actually. Some of us, occasionally, not for a while, but occasionally we take our physical body and exercise it and don't leave it to chance, occasionally. But our brains, we kind of think, well, they'll just do their thing. Let's just hope for the best. So my second thing would be, actually this thing needs some practice and it needs some training. And we need to train our capacity to be able to notice what we're attending to and to shift that attention onto things that are really helpful when we're in those sorts of situations.
Megan's first point was exactly what I would have said. I wouldn't have said vortex. I would have said paralysis. But then there's that sudden, okay, I know who I can reach out to. They're few and far between, but I know who I can reach out to, and they will just insert a little bit of perspective. And then I can breathe and do the rest of the skills that I know how to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think just taking a hike is good. I usually have to reconceptualize a situation. It's usually something I need to learn. It's a lack of self-awareness on my part if I'm feeling anxious about something. So just try to get a pause.
Physical environment as well. The environment that our physical environment, our ability to connect in with systems larger than ourselves like nature, enables sometimes that another kind of lifeline.
That's it for today. Our show is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to the LinkedIn Presents family and to all our guests for sharing their stories. If you love the show, tell your friends. I would love you to leave a review because they really matter in helping the show get found. You could also follow us or subscribe. If you have a question for me or you want to submit an idea for the show, find me on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, message me, I promise I'll write back, or subscribe to my newsletter for more from the anxious achiever world. Thanks for listening.